Chair recognizes Honourable Member for Bamboo Town. Mr. Speaker, I rise today just to speak briefly on this midterm budget resolution.
I am all down.
And Mr. Speaker, I arise, as I always do in traditional fashion, giving thanks to Almighty God, in whom I live, move, and have my being. Mr. Speaker, I'm an individual who believes in providence, meaning that what happens in the affairs of men is oftentimes a direct result of the will of the good Lord. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because I believe my entrance to this place is as a result of His will, and His will alone. I say that, Mr. Speaker, because I worship a being whom the ancients called El Elyon, God Most High. And the reason, Mr. Speaker, He is called God Most High is because there is none higher. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because the last few months have been somewhat tumultuous. And though there are those who have pronounced my demise, I have said to them before, check my career. Like the proverbial phoenix, Mr. Speaker, I always rise from the ashes. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to get to the other part of this debate, but this is my intro. Because I've seen some things out there in the public sphere as to me owning a house out Old Fort Bay. I look at the picture and I say, my God.
They're speaking good on your life.
I tell you, if I was in a position like that.
I had this like a key.
They put up the picture, Mr. Speaker.
Is it a pretty house?
Well, unfinished.
How many did?
And they say, it's Renward Wales' house that he's building, Mr. Speaker, with hush money.
Oh, I saw that on Facebook.
And so, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say to the members of the DNA and the ANA and whatever kind of other A, what you all should do, rather than telling lies, because it is a lie, Mr. Speaker, I've said so outside this place and inside this place, and I dare them to speak otherwise. You see, because, Mr. Speaker, those persons who will do anything to obtain power ought not to have it. You see, what should happen is they should produce the land papers that says Renward Wells, or my wife name, or my children name, or my ma name, or my pa name, or my friend's name, or people in my campaign name. They should produce that. And then they should produce a permit.
Claim it, boy, claim it.
That says Renward Wells put in for a house to be built in the Ministry of Works. They could go do that. And they could take a picture of the permit. Every building in this country, Mr. Speaker, ought to have that permit number. But I can guarantee you, Mr. Speaker, they can't produce it. You know why?
Angel?
It doesn't exist. I can say it again. Because some people say I shouldn't be proud of this, but let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, I alone work in my house. My wife stays home and homeschools my 6 children and has done so for 22 years.
When
6. I rent a house in Stapleton.
Busy man, you busy man. Busy boy, Red.
I own no property other than one place in this country, Mr. Speaker. You know where that is? That is Drake's Hill, South Andros. Give it to me by my grandma. But Mr. Speaker, we can leave that there.
Can't explain under nobody.
We can leave that there. Mr. Speaker, let me change tunes here. And join in the chorus of this house. I'd say, no, I can have a little chaser. Mr. Speaker, let me, on another note, just extend my condolences to the chief clerk of this house, as other members has done, on the passing of his dear wife. You know, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot cure. Likewise, Mr. Speaker, I can't help but do that. Mr. Speaker, let me also extend my condolences to my
Only for the elderly.
wider family.
Only for the elderly.
Because, Mr. Speaker, we have lost a patriarch. My uncle died on the 10th of February. Ahab Morris, who was a patriarch of my family and for many in the settlement of Drakeshill, those who would have descended from Drakeshill and South Andros. And so many of us are in mourning. And so I extend my condolences again to my wider family. Having done that, Mr. Speaker, you know, there's an ancient Chinese saying that says, may you live in interesting times. Mr. Speaker, it is a saying that has some optimism with it, but it's also a saying, Mr. Speaker, as a word of caution to us. And Mr. Speaker, I have been known in this place to be a Johnny one note on a few issues. And I'm coming back. Yes. I'm coming back to those issues because, Mr. Speaker, I believe that when it comes to what ought to be taking place in the area of energy in this country, our time for action is now. Mr. Speaker, back in 2005, 2006, I was one of those individuals who was on radio along with Gilbert Morris, prophesying that around 2008, 2009, there was going to be a global economic collapse. Many persons said that we were prophets of doom and gloom. We did not know what was going on, Mr. Speaker, at the time. And Mr. Speaker, at that point in time, I remember being in a debate with a few people on a Steve McKinney show. And I told them that the way forward was clear. Because anyone who understood anything about energy futures, about oil, knew that around 2008 and 2009, the prognosticators, according to a theory called Hubbard Peak Model, said that around 2008 and 2009, all of the oil in the world, which is a finite commodity, that humanity would have reached the halfway mark of all of the oil on the earth. And from that point in time, from the 1890s when it was first discovered and started being used up until 2008, that the societies which would have used oil to develop themselves with electricity, with cars, would have been so many. But because of the expansion of technology and the growth in other nation states, you would have a finite commodity now, more nations wanting it, so the price was going to go up. Gilbert Morris and I got into a debate, and Gilbert said on Steve McKinney's show, he said, listen, oil is going to go to $150 a barrel. I said, I cannot believe that. My view was that it was going to $100. At that point in time, Mr. Speaker, oil was $40 a barrel. And I said that there's no way the global community could withstand $150 barrel oil. I didn't see the global economy being able to come back from that. At that point in time, Mr. Speaker, Gilbert offered one solution, which I accepted, as a way forward for the Bahamas so that we could survive the global economic downturn. And I offered another solution. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, had the Bahamas done both of those, we would have been in a better place and been able to survive the global economic hurricane that came. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, as I said in this place, when I first got elected to this place, I said, I believe that we ought to be building a domestic economic economy, Mr. Speaker, that is able to survive the global economic shocks, the hurricanes that come. Because in many ways, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamas cannot do anything about what happens outside its borders in terms of what goes on in the West. Our effect on those things is very limited. But what we can do is prepare ourselves as we, the Bahamian people, have been doing for centuries. We build our houses to survive the coming hurricane. And I said we ought to build this economy in a way whereby when it happens, we're able to go through the storm. I offered at the time that the Bahamas needed to move immediately with the introduction of LNG facilities to keep the cost of energy down. Gilbert Morris then said, good idea. I believe what we ought to do is take 10% of the Bahamian foreign reserve, buy gold, which was trading at $350 an ounce at that time. He said when the crash comes, gold is going to go through the roof. Other countries are going to want to buy it. If the Bahamas government takes about $100 million of its reserves now, buy gold at $350 an ounce, we would be sitting pretty. But Mr. Speaker, gold went from being $350 an ounce to, in 2010, to being $2,000 an ounce. Mr. Speaker, we remember also at that point in time, it was only a few of us. There was only a few of us proselytes who was preaching LNG. Most folks was listening to another group of people who were neither scientists nor economists. And they were saying, man, y'all put that here in NASA, the place can blow up. But there was one member of the Progressive Liberal Party who was all over the place saying, we ought to do this. That was Leslie Miller.
Member for Tall Pines.
The member for Tall Pines. Mr. Speaker, suffice to say, in all fairness to the then PLP administration, the Prime Minister said, listen, my response would be this. I believe that we are going to have a number of foreign direct investment projects going on. We're going to be able to keep the construction industry of the Bahamas going forward. And if we do those two things, if it happens, we'd be able to survive. Now, whether the Prime Minister's theory would have worked or not, we're not sure, because he lost the election of 2007. But I know one thing, Mr. Speaker. We are right back at that place again. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why I said we need to make some concrete decisions now about BEC is because many of the things that was taking place in the global community then is what is beginning to start taking place in the global community again. Mr. Speaker, we have, for the first time in 4 years, the petroleum industry has not recorded a giant oil fine in 4 years. The last time this stretch happened, Mr. Speaker, was in 1950. And additionally, I can get to Putin because he's a part of this problem too. In 2008, Mr. Speaker, just before the global crash, Vladimir Putin, who said that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest atrocity in the history of mankind. Vladimir Putin, in August of 2008, sent Russian troops across the border into what was a former Soviet republic called Georgia to support Russian speakers in 2 republics of Georgia. The Republic of South Ossetia and another republic called Abkhazia. The minute he did that in August of 2008, Mr. Speaker, oil went from being $70 a barrel up to 90. And, Mr. Speaker, I wish that given the current crisis going on right now in Ukraine, where some have said that Russia has sent its troops across the border, well, whether Russia has sent its troops across the border or not, the Russians in eastern Ukraine, they're Russians. They're ethnic Russians. And I would have wished, Mr. Speaker, that President Obama did what George Bush did. When Putin sent Russian troops across the border into South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and they were on the outskirts of the capital city in Georgia called Tbilisi. At the 2000 Olympic Games, you could see George Bush and Putin sitting next to each other. And Bush hammering away, and Putin shaking his head. And Bush hammering away and looking away. 10-minute conversation. The very next day, Mr. Speaker, Putin, who was in the stadium in Beijing with George Bush, having that conversation, jumped on his 747, flew into Georgia, met with Russian troops, and in 3 days they had negotiated a peace with the French President Sarkozy. And the situation is still what it was then in Georgia. Now we have, Mr. Speaker, Ukraine. Russia has sent troops over the border into Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. The ethnic Russians in Ukraine have made it quite clear. Last night, they had surrounded the strategic city of Debaltseve. And Mr. Speaker, you know, I was supposed to speak last night, and I was praying that what would have happened is that the Ukrainian soldiers who were trapped in the city, who were refusing to surrender, would have laid down their arms and left, because had they not, I think this morning, Mr. Speaker, the world would be in a different place. But thank God they decided to, and the Russians let them out. But there's a problem, Mr. Speaker. Russia is re-establishing itself in the global order and challenging the global order in ways we have not seen since the Soviet Union. The West's response to it, Mr. Speaker, I think is somewhat weak. But I think it is probably the proper response, though I would have wished Obama would have whispered whatever it was George Bush whispered inside Putin's ear. Because, Mr. Speaker, if you look at current oil prices, Mr. Speaker, the oil prices are now starting to tick up. Mr. Speaker, in 2008, something else was going on while the Russians were asserting themselves. We had problems in that traditional place called the Middle East. The Turks, who established the third Muslim caliphate in 1453 when they conquered the Christian city of Constantinople, and they called it Istanbul on the Bosporus. Oh, not the Turks and Caicos. It's Turkey. It's a beautiful place. Wonderful capital. No longer Constantinople. They make it quite clear. It's called Istanbul. Islam. Jesus is still Lord. Well, some of the churches still ring their bells there. And Mr. Speaker, the Turks in 2008 were once again asserting themselves in the Islamic world. They cut their ties with Israel. They started supporting different groups within the Middle East. That too, Mr. Speaker, led to the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. That put further pressure on the price of oil. Until by October 2008, Mr. Speaker, we all know what happens. The global community could not withstand $150 oil. The collapse came. We see today Russia back at it. And now, Mr. Speaker, we have an even more dangerous threat in the Middle East. That of ISIS. And in addition to ISIS, Mr. Speaker, we have a group called the Houthis in Yemen. Now, Mr. Speaker, I choose to use the word ISIS because I don't like what the Americans are doing in calling it ISIL. Because you see, when you call the group ISIL, what you're saying is the Islamic State in the Levant. The Levant means the Middle East, but the Levant is a term that excludes Israel. Israel has been in the Middle East for over 3,500 years.
What does NASA have to say?
3,500 years. NASA's position is Israel don't exist. That was his position. And he actively tried to make sure that didn't happen. But Mr. Speaker, with the threat of ISIL now in Libya, where they beheaded 21 Christians on the beach, massacre Syrian Christians that have been in Iraq for over 2,000 years, selling their daughters into other parts of the Muslim world like Boko Haram was doing to the Nigerian girls. And now you have the Houthis, a Shia group, about to take control of the strategic port of Aden, through which 10% of the world's oil supply goes every day. As the foreign minister said, we can't allow that to happen. And really, with a straight face, the global community at this stage, trying to come out of this economic downturn, with Europe trying to find its way back, cannot allow it to happen. But Mr. Speaker, that's kind of the global view of what's going on in the world. Mr. Speaker, what should we be doing here in the Bahamas? I said it. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that our lack of decision or our delaying the decision to decide on a strategic partner for BEC is not in our current best economic interest. I believe that we ought to make that decision, make it quickly, position ourselves, because, Mr. Speaker, we said to the Bahamian people that we were going to reduce the cost of electricity. And Mr. Speaker, most Bahamians, a lot of them, are paying mortgage electricity rates. And why LNG? Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that the current fuel we use, bunker C and automotive diesel oil, bunker C is competitive with LNG. The problem with bunker C is that the fuel rate, the heat rate of bunker C, Mr. Speaker, whereas you could use a minuscule amount of LNG to get an engine going, the amount of bunker C it takes to get the same fuel rate, heat rate, is massive. Bunker C works in slow-speed diesel engines, and Mr. Speaker, the amount of maintenance required for these slow-speed diesel, Mr. Speaker, is massive.
Which one works the best?
If we make that decision, Mr. Speaker, to move in the direction of LNG, to move in the direction of installing aeroderivative engines, which is basically a jet engine, Mr. Speaker, we could dramatically reduce the cost of electricity to the Bahamian people. And in the environment of the tax we have put on them VAT, and I said in this place, Mr. Speaker, that I voted for VAT, with the caveat, Mr. Speaker, that once we would have reduced the cost of electricity to the Bahamian people, that in and of itself would have lowered the cost of living. Because if I'm paying $600 a month for an electricity bill, and you have now taken BEC's bill from 42 cents a kilowatt down to 21, that's half. So rather than me paying $600, I now have $300, Mr. Speaker, of disposable income. The effect of that in the economy of the Bahamas, Mr. Speaker, would have been far-reaching, and still can be. The member for St. Anne said if he had a $600 light bill, wow.
He lives in a mansion, he's a rich man.
So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we ought to move in that direction sooner rather than later. And, Mr. Speaker, we ought to give that kind of economic relief to the Bahamian people, because, Mr. Speaker, if we did so, it would all go well for us as a people. Having touched on that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to touch on one other thing that concerns me before I take my seat. And that is something that was spoken to by the member for Marco City. When Marco City said that 58%, I want to say it again, 58% of the Bahamian electorate will be at the next general elections between the ages of 18 and 35. Mr. Speaker, given that fact, youth unemployment is something that we in this progressive Liberal Party government ought to give serious consideration to. And the way the World Bank describes youth unemployment, Mr. Speaker, it says those persons between the ages of 15 and 25 is who fall into that area of youth unemployment. And, Mr. Speaker, nation states deal with those kinds of individuals in three ways. Three ways. One, those persons are usually gaining education, either at the high school level or at some tertiary institutions. And so nation states would provide college grants, they'd give them scholarships, they have universities where those persons can gain the requisite skills to become a part of the workforce to better cause the nation to continue to develop in the direction it should go. That's one. Two, nations, for those who are not a part of going to school, as the foreign minister would say, they end up in the private sector, in the workforce, learning a trade, being an apprentice. And Mr. Speaker, we tried to address some of that when we passed, I think in 2013, the National Training Agency Bill. But Mr. Speaker, I'd like to offer to this nation the third way a lot of countries around the globe have dealt with it. And it's a controversial topic. But I believe at this stage in our national development, Mr. Speaker, it is a conversation we ought to have, because the impact of it affects our economy in terms of crime, in terms of what we do with discipline with our people, in terms of how we get them inculcated into loving this nation. And Mr. Speaker, it is that third rail of national service. Mr. Speaker, I am fond of speaking about two nations in this parliament and outside this parliament. That of Israel and Singapore. And Mr. Speaker, I can readily make the case as to why I believe those two nation states have gotten it right and are continuing to get it right for their people. They are. The United States also had a form of national service up until the Vietnam War. They did away with it. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is this, Mr. Speaker. The effect, when you look, Mr. Speaker, as to what happened during the global economic collapse and nation states that went through it and survived it, there is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, of the resiliency of a nation like Israel and the resiliency of a nation like Singapore. And Mr. Speaker, in the 1960s, Lee Kuan Yew said it. He said, we are going to institute national service, not just to try and protect us from the Malaysians, because I believe that it's going to inculcate in my people a love for this little 21 by 10. That's as large as Singapore is, the size of Nassau. 2.5 million people. And, well, they did, in building the airport, they did double it. But the fact of the matter is this, Mr. Speaker, the results of national service, Mr. Speaker, is quite evident. To where many who look at Israel, who look at Singapore and try to trace the one entity that causes their people to be able to achieve, they always seem to come back to that idea of taking those young persons when they leave high school, putting them in service within their country, allowing them to be able to be mentored by older persons, putting them through basic training, teaching them about the wherewithal of their nation, getting them to love themselves and to love the people with whom they live and exist. That the results of that, Mr. Speaker, all goes well. And you know, Mr. Speaker, Singapore in 2007 wasn't even involved in the gaming industry. Now it's one of the global leaders. And the foreign minister, Brother Mitchell, knew exactly where I was going. When Singapore wanted to establish its national service, Mr. Speaker, when Singapore wanted to establish its national service, you know what it says? We're going to Israel. They got it right. We can call in the United States. They got it right. But when they wanted to learn about gaming, you know what they did? They say, them folks in the Bahamas, they know something we ought to know. So they came here. And they learned. And went back there. So I say, Mr. Speaker, if they came here for the gaming information, Let us go there for the national service education and information. I believe it is high time, Mr. Speaker, that we seriously begin to consider it. But, Mr. Speaker, it is something that we ought to ensure that we do, and that we do well. Mr. Speaker, I want to end on a good note, and that is to commend my Prime Minister for the road he is taking in regards to telecommunications liberalization. You would remember in this place, Mr. Speaker, again, when I first stood up in this place and began to speak about telecommunications, I said that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can look around the globe as to who got it right. And like the good Lord would have said, when you see somebody doing it right, go and do likewise. When the former administration was about to sell BTC, I was out in the streets. I was in another place. Me and the member for Charlotte was in another place. But, Mr. Speaker, and some, Mr. Speaker, jokingly said we going back there. But, Mr. Speaker, we were outside this place. And when I came inside this place, I brought what I said outside this place. That the Canadians, Mr. Speaker, got it right. And you know what they did? The Canadians say, listen, we can liberalize our telecommunications sector. The government is going to sell us telecom, but you know what we can do? The first 15 years, 20 years, we don't want no foreigners involved. None. We got enough Canadians involved in the telecommunications industry. Let the Canadian banks give them money, let them buy the company, and let them compete amongst themselves. The Canadian government did that. Well, you know, Canada's a part of the WTO. So, some WTO members say, hold on now, you all can't do that. After about 15 years, you're not going to allow foreigners in there. So you know what the Canadians said? The Canadians say, sure, we'll let you in. But no foreign entity can own more than 46.7% of any Canadian telecommunications company. You will never be the majority shareholder as a foreigner. You can be the largest shareholder, but you're not going to be the majority. And Mr. Speaker, when the Right Honourable Member for Centerville stood up and said, we ain't giving nobody no more than 49%. But 51% will be owned by the Bahamian people. That, Mr. Speaker, is the right thing to do for and on behalf of the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, we lost the opportunity to do the first part of it, which was to take all them BTC workers and let them establish companies. And now we just talk about layoffs. The other entity that is coming is now going to have an opportunity for some skilled labor. But, Mr. Speaker, let no one say that the Right Honourable Member and this government is not getting it right in the area of telecommunications. Mr. Speaker, and as I take my seat, I want to go back and reiterate. The scripture says that where there is no vision, the people perish. But happy is he who keeps the law. And Mr. Speaker, a clear vision has been laid out for well over 2 years as to what ought to happen for the Bahamian people in terms of reducing the cost of living for them. We need that strategic partner for BEC, and I don't know which one it is my government is thinking about choosing, but whichever one it is, that which you do quickly. And please let it be the one with LNG. Because LNG is good for me. Mr. Speaker, I support this resolution.